Greetings. My name is Ed Wolf, and I serve as treasurer for the Church of the Brethren. We appreciate you taking this time to review the 2022 year-end financial presentation. During this presentation, we will review the dashboard handout, the giving summary, exhibit number 1, income and expense reports, exhibit number 2, and the designated restricted funds and net assets report, exhibit number 3. We will start with a review of the net asset chart on the top left-hand side of the dashboard handout. Before we look at the numbers, let's begin with a few reminders about our net assets. Our net assets are split into two categories, those without donor restriction and those with donor restriction. Assets without donor restriction include our core ministries, land building equipment funds, self-funding ministries, and designated funds. Assets with donor restriction include split interest agreements, special purpose funds, restricted funds, like Haiti Medical and Ministry Assistance, as well as our endowments and some perpetual trusts. Additional details on our net assets can be found on exhibit number 3, page 4. Our net asset numbers as of year-end 2022 are highlighted in yellow on the slide. At $39.7 million, our total net assets decreased $8.8 million from the beginning of the year. At $22.4 million, assets without donor restriction decreased $5.7 million from 2021. This decrease is primarily due to the investment losses from 2022. At $17.3 million, assets with donor restriction decreased $3.1 million from last year. This decrease is also primarily due to investment losses. However, there was also a large transfer from our pooled income fund to net assets without restriction, representing an accumulation of transfers that should have been made as various pooled income fund accounts were closed out over the years. Our balance sheet remains liquid with 56% of net assets held without restriction. As of the 2021 audit, we had approximately 52 months of expendable reserves. This means the Church of the Brethren could go 52 months without relying on additional revenue. The benchmark is 5 months. However, this number is inflated due to lower than normal expenses. With program expenses increasing, our expendable reserves are expected to decrease. Tracking net assets is important because net assets represent the Church of the Brethren's total value and expresses the difference between what we own and what we owe. This is a key indicator of an organization's financial health. Despite the investment losses, the Church of the Brethren's net asset position continues to be very strong, primarily due to the generosity of our donors, limiting our liabilities, not taking on any additional debt, and remaining disciplined with our long-term investment strategies. A healthy net asset balance is also important for the Church of the Brethren to continue to provide mutual support to the larger church body, to be more like Jesus in the neighborhood, by carrying out our core ministry programs and by issuing grants through the Ministry Assistance Fund, Emergency Disaster Fund, Global Food Initiative Fund, Brethren Faith and Action Fund, and our designated funds. We will next review the investment and cash balances chart as of December 31 on the bottom left side of the dashboard handout. 2022 numbers are highlighted in yellow. At $33.3 million, our investments decreased $8.4 million since the beginning of the year. Despite modest gains in December, the S&P 500 index lost over 19% in 2022, recording its worst year since the financial crisis in 2008. Reasons for the bear market include the war between Russia and Ukraine, surging inflation, and the first interest rate hikes since 2018. Remaining disciplined to our investment strategy, which focuses on long-term goals, risk tolerances, timelines, and purpose of funds, should help the Church of the Brethren navigate the continued market volatility. The market was off to a good start this year, with the S&P 500 gaining 6.2% in January, its best January since 2019. The market was down a little in February, bringing the year-to-date return approximately 3.4%. Prior to the board meeting, staff will receive a full report on our investment returns from Ader Financial. The board will then receive a more detailed investment report from the Audit Investment Committee during its meeting. Before we move to a review of the cash balances, I would like to express our appreciation to the Ader Financial staff for their fund management services on behalf of the Church of the Brethren and for their reporting to the Audit Investment Committee. At $1.2 million, our cash balance increased $237,000 since the beginning of the year. Just a reminder that cash balances tend to be low during the summer months and then increase as year-end giving picks up. We also saw a larger number of 2022 donations received after December 31st. These donations are counted as 2022 gifts, but the cash was not deposited until January. All this is to say that timing can play a role in cash balances. There are no concerns from our auditors as the Church of the Brethren maintains good liquidity with healthy operating cash balances at both Elgin and New Windsor banks. Healthy cash balances are important because they become the payment for expenses that sustain the Church of the Brethren's missions, expenses for program supplies, ministry resources staff, and other vital operating expenses. We will next review the December 31 donor numbers on the bottom right chart of the dashboard handout. 2022 numbers are highlighted in yellow. Just a reminder that this chart represents the total number of donors contributing to all ministries during the year. 588 congregations donated to Church of the Brethren Ministries in 2022. While this is close to last year's total, it is still the lowest number of donor congregations over the last 5 years and well below the 700 average over the last 5 years. As a reminder, mission advancement staff are sending a personal acknowledgement of any gift received to congregations. Staff are also contacting congregational leadership via phone, email, or handwritten note to ignite conversation, steward relationships, provide education on our ministries, and to foster covenant between congregations and the Church of the Brethren. Staff have been analyzing data sets of our individual donors and congregations to determine points of engagement and giving trends with denominational ministries, sharing their findings with the Sustainability Committee. A couple of letters from congregations who have decided to no longer send congregational contributions have come across the Director of Mission Advancement's desk. Staff have reached out directly to the person sending the letter on behalf of the congregation. The intent of the conversation is to better understand how the congregation came to their decision, provide explanation of how congregational contributions are used and their impact, and to determine if the congregation would be open for a visit. To date, no visits have been scheduled, but the conversations have been positive and well received. More than 2,200 individual donors contributed to Church of the Brethren Ministries in 2022. This is the second lowest number of donors over the last 5 years and well behind the 2,500 average over the last 5 years. One of the main reasons for the consistent response from our individual donors over the last 5 years is the personalized contacts that our mission advancement staff are making in reaching out to support our donors. Staff are making telephone calls, sending emails and postcards, along with birthday and sympathy cards, personal letters, and text messages that aid in educating donors on our ministries and show the impact of their contributions. As in previous years, staff are also intentional with being a presence in our districts, making a commitment to attend as many district conferences as possible last year. In 2022, we had over 2,800 total donors contributing to the Church of the Brethren Ministries. This is well below our 3,100 average number of donors over the last 5 years. We added trend lines to this chart that are helpful when the numbers increase or decrease at higher rates. The trend lines help to show patterns and tell us when our numbers are below or above expectations based on the trend. For this past year, the individual and total donor numbers were below expectations, while the congregation number was slightly above expectations. The key takeaway from all these donor numbers is that the Church of the Brethren remains grateful to all donors that faithfully contributed to our programs and ministries over the last year, via prayer or financially or with their volunteer service. For a review of the 2022 core ministries giving, we will look to the top right chart on the dashboard handout. 2022 numbers are highlighted in yellow. Giving from congregations totaled $1.55 million in 2022. This is down only $48,000 from last year. However, this amount is the lowest giving total in the last 5 years and $250,000 below the 5-year average of $1.8 million. Giving from individuals totaled $711,000 in 2022. This is up $2,000 from last year. We are sincerely grateful for this generous support as it is the highest giving total in the last 5 years and $137,000 above the 5-year average of $574,000. Total core ministries giving was $2.26 million. This is down $46,000 from last year's total. This total is the lowest in 5 years and $100,000 below the 5-year average of $2.36 million. Despite the increase in individual giving, we are currently experiencing a decline of 5.3% or $126,000 from the total giving high in 2018. We also added trend lines for the core ministries giving chart to help show expectations. The trend lines help to show the steady decline in congregational giving, coinciding with a steady increase in individual giving dating back to 2018. Total giving is declining slightly over the last 5 years. We will look at the giving actuals and budget comparisons in review of the giving summary exhibit on the next slide. We will next turn to exhibit number 1 to review the giving summary. The Giving Summary exhibit is a helpful resource because it breaks down total giving by type, congregation or individual, and by use, with restriction, without restriction, special purpose, bequest, and endowment. The Giving Summary is also useful in comparing year-to-year actuals along with budget comparisons. As we have in the past, we will start at the top of the exhibit with congregational giving. At $1.55 million, congregational giving to core ministries was down over $48,000 from last year and $63,000 behind budget. Just a reminder that we budgeted $1.53 million in congregational giving for this year. This is based on 10-year giving trends with a 4.3% decline. Congregational giving will need to hold steady at last year's giving amount to better this year's budget. In 2022, 476 congregations gave over 1,600 gifts to core ministries. This is 27 fewer congregations and 145 fewer gifts when compared to last year. Congregational giving to restricted funds totaled $1.18 million and was down $88,000 from last year. Despite the overall decrease in giving to restricted funds, giving to Emergency Disaster Fund was up 26%, and giving to Global Food Initiative was up 10%. District disaster auctions for Brother Disaster Ministries were held for the second time since the pandemic, raising $793,000 in support of the Emergency Disaster Fund. We also had 710 gifts totaling $168,000 in response to this year's offerings. This is down $2,400 from last year. In efforts to increase the offering total, staff have provided personal reminders for standing orders along with an online method for direct giving. At $3.5 million, total congregational giving was up $127,000 from 2021. This is due primarily to the disaster relief auction giving. We will next move to the middle of the exhibit for a review of individual giving. At $711,000, individual giving to core ministries was up $2,000 from last year and $117,000 ahead of budget. We celebrate that this is the highest giving total since 2009. For comparison, the 2023 individual giving budget is estimated to be $725,000. This is based on the 10-year giving trend with a 3.6% increase. If the trend continues, we should meet this giving amount for this year. In 2022, we had over 1,200 donors give over 2,600 gifts to core ministries. This is 300 fewer donors and 600 fewer gifts than last year. Although giving was higher last year, we had fewer donors that gave larger gifts. Individual giving to restricted funds totaled $965,000. This is up $85,000 from last year. Web giving totaled $267,000 and 1,500 gifts. This is a decrease of approximately 24,000 and 200 gifts from last year. There were 46 recurring gifts last year compared with 49 gifts in 2021. At $2.6 million, total individual giving was down $1.7 million from last year. This is primarily due to the significant decrease in bequest giving compared to last year. We continue to see encouraging results from the efforts of our mission advancement advocates. Last year, staff began to schedule visits throughout district conference season for a limited number of donors. While not up to pre-pandemic numbers, these select visits were positive and provided insight into how staff will schedule personal visits with donors this year. Staff continue to steward donor relationships with prayers, phone calls, emails, birthday cards for quarterly donors, personalized notes, and thank you cards. Staff continue work at strengthening the narrative budget to help donors more clearly see how their contributions make an impact on our missions, ministries, and projects. Along with these items, staff continue to encourage other ways donors can engage with a denomination through inviting them to conferences, attending webinars, and subscribing to Messenger. To complete the giving summary presentation, we will move to the bottom of the exhibit for a review of total combined giving. At $2.26 million, total combined giving to core ministries was down $46,000 from 2021, but $54,000 ahead of budget. Combined giving to restricted funds totaled $2.9 million. This is up $260,000 from last year. Just a reminder that restricted giving impacts the ministry enablement contribution in support of core ministries. We will look more closely at this impact in review of the income and expense statements in Exhibit number 2. Unrestricted bequests received in 2022 totaled $953,000 and were down $1.76 million from last year. As you recall, the Church of the Brethren was blessed with a very generous and unexpected bequest in December of 2021. We continue to be humbled by this individual's overwhelming kindness in naming the Church of the Brethren a beneficiary of their estate. Unrestricted bequests are important because they fund the bequest quasi-endowment fund, which supports core ministries with a 17% draw. A reminder that part of the 2023 budget proposal includes an increased draw on the bequest quasi-endowment fund at 19%. In looking back over the last 13 years, the bequest quasi-endowment fund has been able to sustain its balance in the sense that our average bequest total of $856,000 plus the average market fluctuation of $295,000 outpaces our average draw of $956,000. We have also been able to draw on the bequest quasi-endowment to support larger responses such as the Nigeria crisis response. For reference, the current balance in the bequest quasi-endowment fund is $6 million. In 2022, we received over 15,000 in endowment additions, 6,300 to support work in Haiti through the Brethren Health Ministries Endowment, and 8,900 to support the work of the Office of Peace Building and Policy and Brethren Volunteer Service through the Peace and Service Endowment. You will see at the bottom of the exhibit the total combined giving was at $6.2 million, $1.5 million lower than last year's giving total. This is primarily due to lower bequest giving and a decrease in donor-restricted gifts. Despite the decrease, the Church of the Brethren continues to be genuinely humbled and sincerely grateful for our faithful donors that contribute to all our ministries. We will next turn to exhibit number 2 to review the income and expense statements as of December 31. Within the exhibit, you will find income and expense statements for our core ministries and self-funding ministries, along with a summary of all program areas. For a review of core ministries' income and expense, we will start on page 2 of the exhibit. Just to note that parentheses on the income side mean a shortfall in income or an unfavorable variance, and parentheses on the expense side mean underspending or a favorable variance. At the top of the exhibit, we see that congregational and individual giving finished the year $54,500 ahead of budget. Including the annual conference offerings, combined giving finished the year $54,000 ahead of budget, matching the numbers on the giving summary exhibit. The ministry annual contribution finished $19,000 ahead of budget. As a reminder, the ministry annual contribution budget is based on a 5-year average and not the year's actual giving. This is why the ministry annual contribution can sometimes finish below budget despite an increase in restricted giving, as we highlighted on the giving summary exhibit. Service fees and other income finished $147,000 ahead of budget. This is primarily due to a large transfer that was made from our restricted pooled income fund accounts to net assets without restriction, representing an accumulation of transfers that should have been made as various pooled income fund accounts were closed over the years. The bequest quasi-endowment transfer was more than $95,000 ahead of budget. Transfers from our bequest quasi-endowment, endowments, savings, and BSC quasi-endowment were ahead of budget by a combined $165,000. A reminder that our transfers are based on a 5-year average, and last year's transfers finished ahead of budget due to higher than expected market returns in the fourth quarter of 2021 and a significant bequest that affected the 5-year average. Looking ahead to this year, the opposite could be true. The significant market downturn in 2022 will negatively affect our 5-year averages, and our transfers will likely finish below budget this year. Since giving finished ahead of budget and our draws were higher than anticipated, we were fortunate not to have to use any of the budgeted $293,000 transfer from designated funds. These funds will be available for future budget shortfalls should we need them. In total, core overhead income ended the year $92,000 ahead of budget. For a review of the core ministry's expenses, we will look to the middle of the exhibit. Ministry areas within the General Secretary Department finished the year a combined $5,000 under budget. Travel expenses for the General Secretary were a little over budget, while grants and professional growth were a little underspent. Mission advancement was also underspent due to less travel, as staff are not meeting in person with as many donors and congregations as they have in the past. Brethren Press finished the year $36,000 over budget. Higher costs for printing and paper, coupled with lower sales, all contributed to the overexpense. Discipleship Ministries was under budget by $23,000. Last year, Discipleship Ministries partnered with Part-Time Pastor Full-Time Church to help support the Parish Collectives Conference in Seattle. The Church of the Brethren had the largest representation of any group attending the conference. The contributions by Part-Time Pastor Full-Time Church and districts helped to reduce the Discipleship Ministries evangelism expense. There was also no New and Renew conference last year. Ministry Summer Service was budgeted for, but with National Youth Conference last summer, this program was not running at full strength. However, Discipleship Ministries continued to place persons who reached out to be placed. There was also no spiritual directors retreat in 2022, as staff are reforming a working group to see what is ahead for the network. Global Mission was $4,000 overspent. This was mostly due to annual conference travel being over budget and a decrease in restricted donations received. There were some transfers from restricted funds, which helped this budget reduce some of the overexpense. Brother and Volunteer Service was overspent by $22,000, primarily due to fewer volunteers, a decrease in volunteer placement fees, and lower FaithX participation. Organizational Resources was under budget by $65,000. Finance was $15,000 overspent, mostly because of travel. Buildings and Grounds in Elgin was underspent in independent contractors, electricity, equipment maintenance, and postage. Rental income was also $20,000 over budget. In total, director level expenses were underspent by $68,000. We will next review a chart that tracks income and expense for core ministries over the last 5 years. In the past, we've received some questions about core ministries' income and expense pre-pandemic and what the numbers look like coming out of the pandemic. This chart helps to provide an illustration of actual income and expense from 2018 through 2022. When looking at the expense numbers, or the red line, keep in mind that 2020 and 2021 expenses do not include the transfers from core ministry surplus to the budget shortfalls designated fund. This was done to better reflect actual departmental expenses over those years. This chart gives us a visual of what pre-pandemic expenses look like in 2018 and 2019 in comparison with the pandemic years that followed. While we realized 2 very low years of expenses in 2020 and 2021, the 2022 expenses are more realistic of what we anticipate expenses to be like with closer to fully operating ministries. From 2018 to 2020, our expenses decreased over $760,000, while our income decreased $495,000. As we look back at last year, we see our income increased $384,000 and our expenses increased $602,000 from the low water marks in 2020. We can also see the shrinking gap between the income and expense lines as we move out of the pandemic restrictions. If this trend continues, we can expect 2023 actuals to more closely resemble the results from 2018 and 2019. A reminder that our 2023 core ministries budget of $5.3 million income and expense exceeds that of pre-pandemic budgets for 2018 and 2019. It is important to emphasize that as our expenses increase to full ministry operation, the designated funds transfer and surpluses that we realized over the last 3 years may need to be relied on more routinely to fill the income shortfalls in our annual budget. We will turn back to page 1 of exhibit number 2 for a summary of all ministry budget variances. More details can be found on pages 2 through 4 of the exhibit. As noted, core ministries finished the year with $160,000 surplus. On the income side, it was noted that we received a large transfer of $157,000 from previously restricted assets into assets without donor restriction. This transfer amount is included in the service fees and other income line on page 2 of the exhibit. On the expense side, staff stayed close to their budgets and did a good job of allocating resources among the increased program area expenses that resulted from returning to full ministry operations. Processing kits, medical supplies, quilts, and donations are the primary sources of income for Material Resources. Last year, Material Resources processed the shipment of 2 40-foot containers of supplies for an airplane hangar in Liberia, bringing in $6,000 in additional income. However, the cost of cartons, bale sheets, steel strappings, and packing supplies have increased significantly. The increased expenses offset the higher income, and Material Resources finished the year $3,000 behind budget. Material Resources increased processing fees last September to help offset the increased cost of packing supplies going forward. Conference Office finished the year with a deficit of $68,000. Lower than expected attendance had the most significant impact in almost doubling the anticipated deficit. Expenses related to travel, AV equipment rental, and the unanticipated purchase of 3,000 masks played a role in the increased expenses. We will stay on page 1 of the exhibit for a review of the net asset balances for all ministry areas. Ending net asset balance for core ministries is $2.2 million. There will be no year-end transfer as this balance is well above the $1.5 million threshold required by our financial policies and our auditors. Brethren Press operations were brought into core ministries, and their net deficit of $433,000 is recorded separately. This deficit will be addressed after Brethren Press has had a couple more years to operate within core ministries. In the meantime, any losses or gains will be absorbed by core ministries until a decision is made. Material Resources has a net asset deficit of over $188,000. As noted last October, the board approved a recommendation to appoint a new committee to consider questions about property management at both the general offices and Brethren Service Center, including further assessment of material resources and to bring recommendations to the board. Built-up surpluses from prior annual conferences helped the conference office absorb this year's deficit. At the end of 2022, the conference office maintained a net asset balance of $368,000. The 2022 net asset balance for total operations was $2.4 million. This is up $88,000 from the beginning of the year. To wrap up exhibit number 2, we will turn to page 5 for a review of the special purpose funds. Emergency Disaster Fund donations as of year-end totaled $2.2 million, while expenses and grants totaled over $1.6 million. Last year, Brethren Disaster Ministries allocated $215,000 in grants to Partners for Ukraine in response to the humanitarian crisis. Brethren Disaster Ministries was also a recipient of a grant that provided $30,000 in Lowe's gift cards to buy materials and $4,200 to support volunteers repairing homes impacted by last year's flooding in Maryland. In 2022, rebuild projects were organized in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. There were also Children's Disaster Services grants for the summer storms and deployment in Uvalde, Texas after the school shooting. In response to the hurricanes, Brethren Disaster Ministries allocated $70,000 from the Emergency Disaster Fund in support of hurricane damage in both Puerto Rico and Florida. After year-to-date grants and expenses, the Emergency Disaster Fund finished with a balance of $2.3 million. Global Food Initiative Fund donations as of year-end totaled $322,000, while expenses and grants totaled $183,000. In 2022, staff met with Global Food Initiative partners to facilitate relationships building and to review projects funded with grants from the Global Food Initiative Fund. Staff traveled to Colombia to meet with leaders from the Venezuela COB, to Ecuador, Haiti, Honduras, and the Dominican Republic to supervise existing projects and listen to local leaders to learn about future plans. In Honduras, an urban poultry project was initiated with the assistance of longtime partner Project Global Village. While in Honduras, staff were able to visit home construction sites that were being funded by the Emergency Disaster Fund. After year-to-date grants and expenses, the Global Food Initiative Fund finished with a balance of $216,000. Emerging Global Mission Fund ended 2022 with a balance of $117,000, an increase of $2,600 from 2021. Donations are received from only a few congregations and donors. In the past, grants have been used to fund church missions, new and emerging international missions, and church planting in the U.S. We will next turn to exhibit number 3 for a review of our designated funds, restricted funds, and net assets. We will start with a review of the designated funds, which can be found on page 1 of the exhibit. This exhibit shows the beginning balances, additions, uses, ending balances, and staff contacts for all of our designated funds. A reminder that these funds are unrestricted and can be repurposed. For this presentation, we'll highlight a couple of the largest changes from last year. Changes are noted in the net add use column. In 2022, we were able to reduce our post-retirement liability and made a $93,000 transfer to the Human Resource Carryover Designated Fund. The post-retirement liability is a calculation made by actuaries to determine our liability for current and retired staff should they elect to take our health insurance upon retirement. This designated fund amount would be available to offset future years' expense if we needed to increase the post-retirement liability. This exhibit is also where you will find the 2020 and 2021 transfers from core ministry surpluses to the redirected funds budget shortfalls designated fund. The surpluses are included in the $662,000 January 1 balance and are available for future budget shortfalls should we need them. When the upper campus of the Brethren Service Center was sold, the board set aside $100,000 for maintenance of the Germantown church property. In 2022, the remaining $10,000 in funds were used for building maintenance projects in anticipation of the upcoming anniversary. In 2022, Global Mission staff started setting aside funds for their annual budget in anticipation of the Mission Alive Conference in 2024 and the National Youth Conference travel reserve for 2026. Staff also split out the National Older Adult Conference reserve from the Discipleship Ministries carryover for use toward this year's conference. At the bottom of the exhibit, you can see that our designated funds balance decreased $5.9 million, resulting in a year-end balance of $15.5 million. The decrease includes uses, additions, and market losses. We will next look at the restricted donations and miscellaneous special projects found on page 2 and 3 of exhibit number 3. This exhibit also shows the beginning balances, received use amounts, ministry enablement contribution, and ending balances for all our restricted funds. Unlike designated funds, these funds are restricted by the donor and cannot be repurposed. Funding for these projects is outside the normal scope of any Church of the Brethren ministry budget. Additions for these funds are recorded in the donor restricted gifts line on the giving summary exhibit, and these assets are recorded as other under the restricted funds in the net assets on page 4 of this exhibit. The fourth page of this exhibit details a breakdown of our total net assets. We already reviewed the total net assets in the dashboard handout, but this exhibit provides additional details in comparing net asset balances from 2021 to 2022. The exhibit provides additional breakdown of unrestricted assets into core ministries, self-funding ministries, and designated funds. Restricted assets include former temporarily restricted assets like endowment earnings, split interest agreements, special purpose funds, and perpetual trusts, along with our miscellaneous restricted funds. Most of the balances that we reviewed in the earlier exhibits and on the dashboard handout are detailed on this net asset page. At the bottom of the exhibit, you will see that our total net assets decreased $8.8 million from the beginning of the year, ending the year at $39.7 million. We understand that financial presentations can sometimes be overwhelming and there can be a lot of numbers to interpret. So we'll close with a summary of the key takeaways from our 2022 year-end results. Looking at liquidity. Despite last year's decline in market performance, our net assets and reserves remain in a healthy position. After the last 2 years of significant market growth, our net assets and investments have returned to pre-pandemic levels that we experienced in 2019. Staying disciplined to our long-term investment strategy should help the Church of the Brethren navigate market swings. Our liquidity is still in a very strong position, and we have healthy reserves in place for future years should we be called to use them. We also want to lift up the many grants that were given out this past year to provide mutual support for the larger church in response to the domestic and global needs of those communities in most need. Looking at reliable revenue. We are truly humbled by the increases in individual giving to core ministries, along with the increase in giving to the restricted funds that allow donors to support programs that align with their specific passions. Although we remain concerned by the steady decline in congregational support, our staff are working at ways to strengthen relationships. A reliable giving stream from congregations and individuals will be vital for staff to not only carry out their current ministries, but also to prioritize new programs with the implementation of the strategic plan. Looking at sustained surpluses. The Church of the Brethren continues to be humbled and sincerely grateful for both our donors' faithful giving and for their active participation in support of our denominational ministries. As a result of our donors' generosity and staff's expense management, we did not have to use any of the designated funds transfer from last year. Our core ministries depend on draws from investment balances in the Bequest Quasi-Endowment Fund, BSC Quasi-Endowment Fund, Savings Fund, and Endowment Fund. Without these investment draws, Church of the Brethren would face a significant income deficit each year. The draws from these investment balances help support all core programs and ministries of the Church of the Brethren. In review of our self-funding ministries, the conference office sustained a significant loss last year, primarily due to lower than expected attendance. Material Resources finished the year with a small deficit, mostly due to a considerable increase in packing supply expenses. As a reminder, there is a board-appointed committee that will evaluate property management at both locations, including an assessment of the Material Resources program. Despite the challenges from last year, we look back at 2022 with sincere appreciation for the generosity and faithfulness of our donors and for our staff's dedication in carrying out the denomination's program and ministries. Thank you for this time to review the 2022 year-end financial presentation. We look forward to receiving any questions or comments during the board meeting.